Hello and welcome to Dogs with Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dr. Christian Moevs to discuss the philosophy of Dante Alighieri. Uh, Dr. Moevs' interests include Dante, medieval Italian literature, lyric poetry, poetics, and the intersection between literature and philosophy. He was the co-editor of the Devers series in Dante Studies and was a fellow of the Medievalist Institute. Dr. Moevs, thank you so much for joining with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, just wanted to let the gentle listeners know this episode is not at all meant to be an exhaustive investigation into Dante's philosophy or worldview. You could probably spend your entire life reading his works and understanding his insights. But what we hope to accomplish maybe in this episode is to give a sort of brief introduction to Dante's philosophical and theological themes that are present in his works. And to that end, I figured we could dive right into it. So, Dr. Moevs, who is Dante Alighieri? Why is he so important to the study of medieval history and literature?
That's a big question.
Starting big.
I mean, many people, including many poets and writers, have concluded that he really is the greatest single literary figure in the entire Western canon. And that has a number of foundations. One is that what he attempted and succeeded in doing was of an ambition that was absolutely inconceivable. No one's really tried it since. Maybe James Joyce's Ulysses comes close, that. But to give an all-encompassing vision of reality with a profound philosophical exploration of it. But in order to do that, he had to reinvent what literature sort of was. And in the process, he had to essentially create a new language, establish a new vernacular as a literary language. It's all sort of mind-boggling, the sort of audacity and revolutionary dimension of it.
Right. And one of the things that's sort of central to Dante's life and accomplishments is his humanisms. So during 14th century Florence, there was a sort of revitalization of classical learning, the liberal arts, philosophy, rhetoric. And Dante sort of stands square in that sort of Florentine development of classical humanism. But what I wanted to maybe ask is, what would you say is the relationship between Dante's, or really humanism in general, in the 14th century and sort of the philosophy of the universities or medieval scholasticism? Do they at all stand apart or opposed to one another, or are they to be believed as being in contrast with one another? Because sort of in the popular presentation, they're often seen as butting heads with one another. But I think that in many ways they're very harmonious, and they're sort of after many of the of similar problems.
Yes, the humanism that we talk about that you see in the 14th century in Italy, especially towards the middle of the century, then, with the Boccaccio and Petrarch and so forth, but it's already has its origins in Dante. That's obviously an evolution from what had been, a medieval, what we call a medieval scholasticism. But it's dangerous to use terms like that, because medieval thought is extremely wide-ranging, it's extremely alive, it's extremely adventurous. So you can't really reduce it to a picture that we have of certain, dusty old guys teaching Aristotle in schools. It's not quite, right. It's not quite that simple. So there was, part of the excitement was the rediscovery of Aristotle, this infusion of Aristotelian text that comes in the 12th, 13th centuries. And that reignites on the philosophical side a great interest in classical thought. But there's sort of the equivalent things going on. There's the great sort of translation of what had been the province of clerics and universities into vernacular culture, a kind of laicization of culture. That's a radical movement, and it's intrinsically sort of humanistic. And Dante definitely sees himself as part of that, of being able to spread or share the key food of that banquet with a larger public in their own language, and the faith that you don't need Latin to do it. In fact, a vernacular language can do it just fine. Those are all elements of what we would call a humanistic culture. It's still medieval in the sense that, what would distinguish classical humanism once you get to the Renaissance, say in the early mid 1400s, is that they at that point see a real rupture, that they no longer see this as a continuous tradition. They are starting to look at the classical world and its heritage on its own terms, historically, as something to recover, that they feel removed from, but that they can recover. And part of that is an enormous self-confidence. It's interesting that in the Renaissance, they tore down more classical buildings than they did in the Middle Ages. Because they thought, okay, we learned from it, we can do it better or as well. That's
Sure. Interesting.
But so there's a shift gradually where the emphasis gets more and more, let's say, on the here and now and this world, and less the transcendent perspective. That's kind of what. So Dante might be seen as the apex or flowering of this millennial tradition just before it gives way to a kind of a renewed emphasis on the here and now that kind of de-emphasizes the ultimate end or the great metaphysical picture and so forth. I sometimes say it radically that he's the flowering of a millennial tradition and it collapses right after him. This kind of worldview. It doesn't totally collapse, but it definitely changes.
Sure. And I like what you said about how one of the most humanist elements of Dante's works is that he writes in the vernacular and in the Tuscan dialect. He doesn't write in like the Latin language, which was sort of reserved for like lofty academic disputations. He thinks that Italian is fine on its own, and maybe we'll get to that down the road. But I also wanted to ask, what would you say are Dante's main philosophical influences on his thought? Is it a mixture of classical, Arabic, and Christian thinkers? And I know you mentioned Aristotle as being one of them.
That moment in time is a really special moment. There's a reason that there's this extraordinary flowering of culture and thought in Dante's time. And just think, we're talking about, it's the time where you have Bonaventure and Aquinas, the great new mendicant orders, and Dante. It's an extraordinary moment. And then you get Eckhart on the other side of the Alps. They're all sort of coming around the same time. As I said, it's a kind of flowering or peak of a millennial tradition. And as I also mentioned, what sort of triggers the flowering big time is the excitement of this new this saturation, this dumping of all of the Aristotelian tradition, which had been known only sort of in glimpses up until then, into the pot, into the ferment. So it's a moment when there's an immense amount of stuff available, because you've got the whole Christian tradition with all of its Neoplatonic heritage of its own, through Augustine and the Franciscans and Bonaventure and so forth in Dante's time. But the Aristotle comes in through the Islamic world and through Islamic commentators, and Islamic philosophers are now accessible. So you've got that whole tradition. And then you've got Maimonides and the great Jewish thinkers are part of the pot. And you get Aristotle, who makes you rethink everything down to the origins. All that later philosophy was already deeply grounded in Aristotle and influenced him. by him, but it had developed on its own, and now you get also the original. So with that, it's a kind of triangulation where you have so many philosophical perspectives and influences at work at the same time that it allows going very deep, where you start to put these texts together. That's really what Aquinas is about. He's taking everything that's available to him and trying to make sense of it, and thus go deeper into the import of Christian revelation. In light, since Christian revelation, by definition, has to be able to encompass all truth. If it can't encompass what's true in Aristotle, we got a problem, right?
Right. Right.
So that's what creates this immense ferment and the immense depth and openness. It's one of the really striking moments in all of intellectual history.
And then if I can ask, how would Dante have known about these classical thinkers that are all popping, or classical and contemporary thinkers that are all popping up at around this time? Did he receive an education and that's how he learned about these thinkers? I also understand it that many of the mendicant friars were active in Florence and were sort of using Aristotle and Neoplatonism in their preaching, through Bonaventure or Aquinas. Did Dante sort of pick up on many of these disputations in preaching, or how does he know about all these figures?
That is a fantastic question. That's become a whole new and very fertile line of investigation in the last 10, 20 years in particular, with especially between, but it's actually international, but England, the US, and Italy above all. Ziboransky, Anna Pegoretti. I mean, there's all these people working on it, Lorenzo Dall'Alzo, on very interesting issues about what did Dante actually know? What could he have known and how did he get it? One thing that is certainly not the case is that he did not have the Loeb classics and where he could just read Aristotle from beginning to end, etc.
Sure.
The culture was largely peaceful. Remember, the way you would get a book in Dante's time was that some copy shop, someplace in town, maybe would get a manuscript. And you'd know that they had a certain manuscript and they could copy out a section of it for you. This is how university life went on. You'd get a section of Aquinas, but you'd only have a little bit of it, and you'd never have the whole thing. You couldn't afford it. It was extremely expensive. And then what did that copy shop have? And in Florence, which is really kind of a backwater, intellectually in 1300, it wasn't yet the Florence that's going to be in 1450, But as you said, people were coming through. There were the two great mendicant orders established in Florence on opposite sides of town, Santa Maria Novella with the Dominicans and Santa Croce with the Franciscans. And they ran schools for their own friars because that was a big part of both of those orders' mission. So they would bring people in and people would come through. And what they did do publicly were disputed questions, which were sort of rhetorical exercises that anybody could attend. And they would raise questions, and it was also sort of training sessions for students where you've advanced different authorities and possibilities on these questions, and then the magister will sort of decide it and so forth. There's no question. Dante says himself in his Convivio, one of his earlier works, that he got totally obsessed with philosophy, and he could not stop feeding on this light of the beautiful eyes and lips of this fantastic damsel philosophy, Philosophia's feminine, right? Mm. And he said for 30 bucks, he attended the disputations of the Filosofanti and of the schools and so forth. That probably means he was going to these public disputations at Santa Croce, Santa Maria Novella. There were also Augustinians in Florence. That may be possible too. We don't have as much information on them. So that's one thing, because the way medieval culture worked is that, as I said, it's a mixing pot where these things keep coming in. So if you have a disputed questions, you're going to be bringing in any authority you've heard of or that you know. And a lot of it is kind of piecemeal. from florilegia, meaning these collections of important points from different philosophers and thinkers and theologians. There's, of course, the great sentences of Peter Lombard, which organize a lot of questions with a lot of sources. Dante would have known some of that stuff. He often knows about something Aristotle said from a reference in St. Albert the Great or Aquinas. He may not have read through, one of these Aristotelian texts, or maybe a few. I mean, he was traveling around Italy after his exile, where he had access to good libraries in some of these cities, obviously, and he would have had access to libraries because he was already a pretty famous guy. But still, he wasn't traveling with a lot of books. Clearly, he didn't have a huge personal library. But he was really, really smart. I mean, this is a guy, Boccaccio tells us a story that one day Dante had come upon a new text that he didn't know before at a copy shop someplace. And he was reading it right there on the street outside the door, and this huge wedding parade goes by with drums and cymbals and tambourines and dancing, and he's completely oblivious, like it never happened. He had no clue that happened because his focus was absolute. When Dante read something, he basically remembered it the rest of his life and could draw on it. We use Xerox machines for that, meaning that we don't remember anything, but Dante really did. And then at the same time, that capacity to triangulate, to put things together, always in his mind. And that's how you get those results.
Yeah, I remember hearing somewhere that these sort of public, like, quadlibital disputations, they're a lot like sort of, to give a sort of modern equivalent, it's a lot like an Ask Me Anything forum where anybody can ask a question, and the person in charge kind of has to, the master or region or whatever, kind of has to do their best to answer it. And it seems like that it seems like a very plausible way that Dante could have understood or would have had access to these philosophical ideas, because I mean, Aristotle was popular, but he was also very contentious at that time. In different readings, the different orders lended themselves to different readings of Aristotle and in natural philosophy and etc.
Right, and there were reactions, of course, to this radical. It seemed to some like a sort of paganizing thing to bring in all this Aristotle because obviously if you read Aristotle more on his own terms, there's certain things that don't seem to jive perfectly with Christian revelation.
Sure.
The eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect, stuff like that, depending on how you read Aristotle. So there was a reaction, the famous condemnations of Etienne Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, in 1277, where he made a whole list of like 170 some propositions that he condemned, and a lot of them were coming out of Aristotle. About 30 actually would affect Aquinas, So it was but that's exactly why it was so alive. There were the stakes were high in these disputes. They weren't just otiose intellectual disputes. There were things at stake like salvation, understanding, revelation, and so it made a very, very must have been wonderful in some way. Certainly Dante was, addicted to this intellectual ferment. And being one of the smarter guys who ever lived, he managed to use everything he got and penetrate into the issues with a depth and clarity that it's spectacular. I mean, Dante is not just a great poet who does theology. He is also a great theologian who does poetry.
Sure.
And in him, the two become actually one. To do really great poetry is to do really great philosophy and theology. And for Dante, vice versa. Because ultimate truth, is always elusive, and it cannot be constrained into any set of ideas or concepts. That would be contingent and relative. It's got to always have a transcendent dimension that your words are trying to in some way communicate or to trigger an understanding in you, that changes the way you see reality. That is what poetry does. That's why a great theological text has to have a literary dimension. Same with philosophy, for Dante anyway.
Does Dante ever compose explicitly philosophical works in his corpus? I remember you mentioned the Convivio as an early work that Dante writes, and
Right.
it's poetic, it's allegorical, but it's also chock full of philosophy.
Right. So that's also a good question. The Convivio is written in Italian. It's sort of the second of the third, of the great things that Dante writes. He writes his early Vita Nova, which is a collection of early verse that he then sets into a narrative framework with a commentary on those poems. And that's where he creates the whole, let's say, myth of Beatrice, but this transcendent revelatory connection between Beatrice, human love, poetics, revelation, salvation. It's all laid out already in the Vita Nova. That's already one of the most revolutionary works. If Dante had written nothing else, he would be world famous for that first thing. So he does that. And then we have two things that he's working on around the same time. But the Convivio has the same sort of structure as the Vita Nuova, because the idea was to take 14 of his longer, more doctrinal or more philosophically involved canzoni, longer poems. They're lyric poems still, but they're longer, and to comment them. And in doing that, survey an all-encompassing vision of reality in the world and philosophy through this commentary. That's what he starts. He interrupts it after book 4, again, to start the comedy. But at the same time, and as you say, that has a philosophical dimension, but it's not a treatise in philosophy. It's a commentary on a set of poems that brings in all kinds of philosophical issues and ideas. And a lot of those are going to become ingredients of the comedy. But it is already a strikingly philosophically oriented kind of work, from everything from ethics to politics to metaphysics and so forth. But around the same time, he's writing in Latin a work on the nature of language and poetics, and writing in the vernacular is kind of the theoretical justification of writing in the vernacular and what the vernacular can do. But he writes it in Latin because he's addressing the people who don't believe in the vernacular, basically. Right. But that's also, it's the first great treatise in linguistics. And it's got, like the principles of language change. He organizes all the Romance languages, stuff that we now do, but he already did it.
Right.
It's sort of fantastic and very profound reflections on poetry, even technical stuff. He interrupts that in mid-sentence, okay? So clearly the comedy is supplanting both those two. Now later, towards the end of writing the comedy, he does two more things that really are philosophical in the sense that one is the De Monarchia, which is a political treatise, but it's highly philosophical too. It has philosophical dimensions to justify a unified world government, basically the rule of law versus the rule of violence and force, why you need a universal law. That's what Roman Empire means for him. It's not a colonialism. It's a universal rule of justice and law. The other thing he writes right at the end of his life, and this is really, what would answer your question, is this thing on the relative position of water and earth. It's a Latin treatise, and he gives it in Verona at the end of his life. And it's about the ordering of the elements. It's a very strange text. There's all kinds of stuff going on. It's like, why does he do this? And he's addressing these Franciscan intellectuals who don't show up for the lecture, incidentally, because who's this guy to be talking about this stuff? This is Dante off. It's really interesting. But he does want to be taken seriously as a thinker, philosopher. He knows that he knows what he's doing, and he resists. He will not be dismissed. Let's put it that way.
Sure.
So yes, philosophy is in there all the time in his work. It's especially after the Vita Nuova, which already has very interesting dimensions, but after that, it's always there.
What would you say are some of Dante's major philosophical ideas or themes in his works. As you've already alluded to, one of them that there's a fittingness for using the Italian vernacular instead of just merely using Latin to convey complex ideas or concepts. Would you say that's probably his main contribution, or
It's not the main one, but it's a radical one. What he realizes is that since truth is transcendent, it doesn't, it's not related to which language you're using. All languages are equal, let's say, in their pursuit of truth, because truth is going to be beyond all of them. It's not like Hebrew or Latin has a privileged access to grasp or express truth, because truth is not a set of ideas or concepts. So you can find ways in whatever language of addressing ultimate questions and mysteries. That is a key evolution in his own thought. Early on, he did think that maybe Hebrew or Latin. Well, Latin, I think, probably had doubts all along, but Hebrew initially may have had some privilege.
gotcha?
But it was a bilingual culture, for people who were highly educated. So yeah, and it's very interesting even all the way through the 1300s. So for Petrarch, just a side note, for Petrarch, his personal language was Latin. That's what he writes all his shopping lists in and his personal notes to himself. But he writes these abstract, incredibly beautiful lyric poems of love in Italian. For him, that was an abstract language.
Right.
Like
Interesting. And another interesting sort of theme in Dante is sort of the relationship between human love and then you might say sort of the divine providential love. And Beatrice, especially in the comedy, becomes sort of a symbol for divine love and divine providence. I mean, Beatrice is the thing that's sort of driving the whole pilgrimage through hell and back again, and he finally meets her sort of on the edge of heaven. It's her and it's she who guides him through the layers of heaven.
That's probably the deepest thing that Dante did overall, and it's probably the driving sort of engine of everything he did, was to realize that there's a continuity between human love and divine love. Now, obviously, that intuition, it's in the Song of Songs, and
right.
And he definitely fed on that too. But it goes extremely deep in Dante because it reaches all its philosophical underpinnings, which is fundamentally that the ultimate ontological reality, the ultimate reality of all, the ultimate reality is what we would call probably consciousness or awareness. The medieval term was intellect. Intellect is, which is a kind of self-awareness, but that is one with the principle of being. It is the principle of being, and in itself, it is God. It's the transcendent reality. Now, why is Dante's first name for intellect, being, and so forth is love? Why? Because what is intellect but in a power? It's a power. Consciousness is a power to experience. It's self-aware. It's reflexive. So it's a power to experience itself as this or that. And that for Dante is really how the world comes into being, right? On a cosmic level, this ultimate reality spawns all possible experience and knows it as itself. Well, of course, it's also in a sense other because the finite ephemeral world it projects is finite and ephemeral, and it itself is untouched, and it's like a dreaming intelligence in a dream. You can completely be in the dream, give yourself to the dream, experience it, and yet you're ultimately untouched if you're the dreamer. That's this relation. Dante calls that's love, actually, to recognize the other as self, to give yourself to the other. So therefore, by definition, human love is just one, it's an immediate experience of what for Dante is an ultimate reality. And that's why a love for this girl next door in Florence can lead him straight into the vision of God and experience all of space-time within himself.
So then, if I can maybe shift to talking more specific themes about Dante's philosophy and how it sort of is imbued in his literary works, I figured we could first talk about Dante's cosmology, or how he sort of sees the structure of the universe. So, if I can ask, how did the medieval world understand the composition of the cosmos and the planets and spheres? How did they understand that?
They had inherited a cosmology, a picture of the world that was very old. It actually sort of started with Plato, who had sort of challenged his students to come up with a kind of mathematical model of how you could account for the movements of all the moving stars that you would see in the sky. In other words, the planets. And they came up basically with this picture, and emerged in the Greek world of this sequence of planets. You had to understand that the moon was closer than Mercury, it was closer than Venus, if you wanted to make a coherent picture of all of this. And so you would get this sequence of planets that they could tell one would have to be sort of farther out than the next, than the previous. Now, what happened then is that with Aristotle, it's that sort of mathematical model actually became to be seen sort of as a physical model, in that you sort of conceive of these planets as embedded in spheres and crystalline transparent spheres. All of this stuff was made of ether, which would be a quintessence, a fifth element, because the four elements that you have under the moon on the world, that's earth, water, air, and fire, those are constantly transmutable into each other, are in constant flux, and create the flux of constant change down here on earth. But once you get, and that those elements are characterized by linear movement, rectilinear movement. Why? The ether, starting from the moon up, that's ether, and that does circular movement, and it's immutable. It doesn't change. This was the idea. And so you get this sequence of spheres, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, the sun, etc. And it goes all the way out to Saturn. And then all the stellar objects, all the sky objects that don't change relative position, were conceived to be embedded in one single sphere encompassing all the rest. And that would be the sphere of fixed stars. That would be the eighth sphere. Now, Aristotle, being a very, very, very smart guy, understood that it makes no sense to talk about that eighth sphere, and hence the whole universe it contains, as being someplace, right? Because all someplace is within the eighth sphere. Okay. It's the extension in space and time is contained in this whole universe. So where's the universe? Aristotle understood that it makes no question. So it makes it very explicit. Outside that eighth sphere, in other words, the cosmos, there is nothing. There isn't space. There isn't void. It makes no sense to talk about anything. So what's there, if you want something there? It's contained in nous, in intellect, in the thought that thinks itself. In other words, all of it is a projection within consciousness. The ground of its being is intellect. Now that is an extraordinary move. And it's going to become very, very important later, especially for Dante. Now, what happens is that in 126 BC, Hipparchus discovers the precession of the equinoxes. Again, these Greeks are also pretty smart. That's the fact that the way we think of it is that the Earth, as it spins, it's also wobbling on its axis of rotation. And it does a complete wobble once every 26,000 years. That makes all the heavens sort of shift. as through the cycle of 26,000 years. Hipparchus and the medievals thought it was 36,000 years. So that would mean, how do you account for that if you've got this model of concentric spheres where each one is sort of transmitting motion in some way to the next? Well, you posit another sphere, a ninth sphere, okay? And the ninth sphere, called the first moved sphere, the primum mobile, is absolutely transparent, has nothing in it, so you can't see it. But what it does is it turns around the Earth once a day completely, and it sweeps everything else around it. That's why all the heavens move around. You know, you look at Orion one night and the next night it has gone all the way around and it's back. But it's not back at exactly the same point because of the precession of the equinoxes, meaning that every night, if you look up at Orion, it's actually slipped back a little bit. And that is the motion of the eighth sphere. It takes 36,000 years to go the other way for Dante and his time. Now that's the cosmos. Now the Christians had a particular problem. Okay, where do you put the resurrected blessed who have bodies and stuff? Well, you got to have a space, so you posit outside the ninth sphere the Empyrean, which for them was a kind of highly spiritual, intellectual realm, but it was kind of also had to be a bit physical because these people had bodies, glorified bodies, okay, but you can't say there's, you know, they're not real, you know?
Right?
That's, you know, so that was the Empyrean that Dante inherited. His radical move is that he sees right through the ambiguities and incoherences of the notion of the Empyrean as a physical realm. And he goes right back to Aristotle, and he understands that the Empyrean has to be pure intellect or being. It's got to be identified with God. And this is a radical move in his time.
Right. As I understand it, there was some debate among scholastic philosophers whether we are supposed to understand the Empyrean, like the outermost sphere, if you want, whether or not it was physical, or if it was physical, what kind of physical. And one of the moves that Dante makes is, okay, no, it doesn't make sense to think of it as physical. If the universe is, if everything is contained within, you know, the eighth sphere, if you want, then anything outside of that, it can't be physical. So one of the moves, as I understand it, that Dante makes is he really drives home the point that, okay, this Empyrean, it's got to be immaterial. It's like, I guess you could call it heaven if you want, but it has to be immaterial.
Yes, so Dante makes it very clear that the primo mobile, that ninth moved sphere that encompasses, is the last body, the greatest body. It's the latest material thing, and it's the latest thing. It's the biggest thing that has extension in space and time. So all extension in space and time then itself doesn't exist in space and time. That's contained in the primo mobile. So where is all that? It's in the Empyrean. The Empyrean is nowhere. It's pure consciousness. The analogy to think of, and it actually holds in many respects, is when you're dreaming and you project a dream world. Where's that world? Where is it? Right? But yet you're in it, you're acting, you're getting chased by lions, you're doing all kinds of things in this dream, and it can be extremely real if you're totally in it. Sometimes you know you're also dreaming and you're sort of in and out and you feel, oh yeah, but I can't die because I'm actually dreaming it all.
Right.
Well, that's kind of like a bit like salvation, right? Where you have a perspective from both within the world of space-time, but are also partly anchored in its ground, which is nowhere and is not ephemeral and can't die.
Interesting. Then if I can maybe ask about the Empyrean, is the Empyrean for Dante understood to be God? I asked this question because if I remember reading the Paradiso, there are a couple of references where Dante likens it to the mind of God or something to that effect. Do I have that right? I vaguely remember that.
But God is nothing but intellect, right?
Okay,
so
right.
Divine mind, it's the divine mind. The Dante says that the entire universe is encompassed only by the divine mind, which is essentially, it's exactly what Aristotle had said. And what this does is it preserves transcendence. The big danger of starting to materialize the Empyrean in any way is that you're starting to mess with transcendence. And then what's God? Where's God? What does it mean to be one with God, to achieve beatific vision, etc.? You know, right. For Dante, it stays very, very clear. He has this extraordinary profundity in his understanding of it. One way that he makes this point very profoundly is that in the primo mobile, which is the sphere within which, let's say, space-time arises from consciousness. So it's the nexus between pure intellect, what is, and the world in space and time, and multiplicity. When he's in the primo mobile, he addresses right off in 3 subsequent cantos the key issues. What's time? What is space? And then what is creation, right? Paradiso 27, 28, 29. It's fantastic because those are the questions raised by being on this nexus between the dimensionless intellect and the world, space, and time. Now, what the point he makes is that there is no how and how the world arises from consciousness. It's a power intrinsic to I am, to being, to the experience of conscious being, awareness. The I am has within it the power to be I am this or that, right? To spawn reality. And the analogy he makes is that it's like the way mathematics arises from the number 1. If you have the number 1, you have in a deep sense all of mathematics, because all of mathematics is tautological. It arises from the concept of number. You have the concept of number, then you can deduce from it everything you want, but it's already implicitly contained in the concept of number, in the number 1. And this is an old idea. It's the same way. If you have consciousness, you have everything possible. The key point is that the world adds nothing to God. It just unfolds certain possibilities that are intrinsic to conscious being. The great theologian Dennis Turner once remarked, he said, you start to understand medieval philosophy, in fact, all Christian, real Christian thought, once you realize that if there were nothing, nothing would be missing, right? Because it's all already there. So then in Paradiso 28, when he's thinking about space, what he sees is a burning point, and that burning point spawns around itself 9 consecutive rings that are all numbered. Again, the idea of arising like number. What is, it's an inverse picture of reality. You can conceive consciousness, the I am, either as a reality that encompasses all possible experience, all possible space and time, or you can experience it as the burning point of your own self-awareness that spawns all of creation around it. And they're equivalent. But that point, the Empyrean, those are transcendent, and everything else, right, is created.
Right. I like what you said about how creation doesn't really add anything to God's being, and I think it's in one of the cantos in the Paradiso, I think it's 29, where Beatrice describes how creation is sort of gratuitous. God doesn't need it. It doesn't add anything to God's perfection or majesty. It's wholly gratuitous. It's a wholly gratuitous gift.
It's an unfolding of love. You know, there's that incredible line, saperse in nuovi amor, l'eterno amore. The eternal love opened itself into new loves. What are new loves? New conscious beings. And it makes the whole world, you know, people say, oh, well, this makes the world unreal. No, I mean, it's unreal in contrast to its source, because the world is contingent and ephemeral. But we all know that, you know, nothing's going to last, you know. What it does do is it makes the world intensely, intensely real and alive. If you experience it as, in a sense, not other than your own being, as immediately present, as an act that is happening at every instant. This is a fundamental idea of creation that one has to get out of our heads. You know, we have this idea that God created the world and then the world sits there. As Augustine says, it's the idea that God is a carpenter. And it's nonsense, of course. It's incoherent. the world is something that God is doing at every moment, if you want. You know, your dream, that something has to be dreaming all this, or it wouldn't exist. It's Patrick Boyd had a nice analogy at Cambridge. He said it's like a light bulb and the sphere of radiance around it. You turn off that light, you take out that light, that whole radiance disappears. So you take away the Empyrean, all of creation is gone like that. It has no being apart from the Empyrean.
Right. I very much like how Aquinas, one of the ways that he likes to explain this is through sunlight and the sun. So sunlight illuminates the sky, and the sky receives the perfection of the light, but it only receives it insofar as it's shining from the sun. And the sun has, whereas the sun has the light by virtue of what it is, it's a sun.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I use the term self-subsistent for that, meaning that it has its being from itself while everything else is contingent. Anything you can talk about or describe is contingent in a sense, including any picture of God we have. That's all part of the contingent world. The reality is always beyond. That's why you need poetry to start awakening to it, addressing it.
Gotcha. Well,
or great theology. Great
sure.
Doesn't lapse into ideology or a set of doctrines. Really great theology, a la Aquinas, who's always pushing you beyond any point you think you've reached.
I mean, one of the big thinkers that's sort of becomes very popular in the late 13th and then early 14th century is Dionysius the Areopagitor. I guess now we would call him Pseudo Dionysius, and that's one of his main themes, is that all the predications we ascribe to God, they're deficient, they're imperfect, and they don't capture what he is in himself.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So Dante, the amazing thing is, how does this guy, who's this ambitious lyric poet and a bit of a politician, who's proud of his marginally aristocratic family, like, how does this guy come to all this?
Right.
Part of it, of course, is exile. It pushed him way beyond where he was, and he started to have to make sense of everything, and it freed him from parochialism, let's say, also, because again, he was an exile in the world, which is probably a rather true image for what our condition really is.
Sure.
So you had to figure it out.
Right. If I can maybe shift the conversation a bit to discuss how Dante understands morality and virtue ethics. I don't think we'll have enough time to discuss his political views, which we could probably devote an entire episode just to that on De Monarchia alone. But how does Dante? A lot of the classical tradition relies on virtue ethics, about having, we in order to be happy, in order to be fully alive, you might say, we have to acquire these sort of dispositions towards doing good actions and good deeds, and these are the virtues. And vices, you might say, are sort of virtues gone towards extremes. And I think Dante sort of describes that well in the Inferno. But if I can ask, how does Dante rank the sins of the sinners in the Inferno? I mean, why are some sins worse off than others? I mean, in the earlier circles of hell, we've got lust, gluttony, greed. They comprise the not as severe circles of hell. But the deeper rings that you get to, the more they're more intellectually based, the more they're more intellectually refined, you might say. I mean, betraying your benefactor, for instance, it takes a lot more, I guess, intellectual effort than it does to, oh, hey, I want that extra piece of chocolate cake, I'm gonna be greedy or gluttonous and eat it. How would you describe how Dante understands the virtues and how they relate to maybe his circles of hell?
Yeah. Again, with Dante, it's always helpful to come back to the fundamental understanding, which in one level is simple, like all truth, but it's therefore infinitely profound. So it's difficult to grasp in a sense. Dante makes it very clear that all sin and virtue is simply a question of love, of how you love. Why? Well, because of what we just said. I think a better way, we probably, those are medieval terms that work okay in the Middle Ages. They're really fraught for us. I would put it more as, how do you live so that you're in harmony with reality, or out of harmony with how things actually are? We have
Sure.
screwed up pictures of ourselves and how things are. So for instance, and this is again going back to very profound Aristotelian ethics. The key point is that no creature, nothing that exists, determines its ultimate goal. What's its ultimate goal? It's to unfold the possibilities of its nature and flourish to the greatest extent possible. So for water, it's simple. You flow downhill. A tree grows. A dog has to eat and have sex and stuff like that. And that sort of takes care of most of the issues. We have all that too. We've got to live and eat and procreate. And so those are all goods that we need to pursue by our nature, by what we are. The problem is that we're sort of complicated because, as I said, in us, this transcendent dimension has arisen, this self-awareness. We're aware of ourselves, and it's this reflexive ultimate principle of reality that's reflected and arises in us. That creates immense possibilities for us. Basically, that we are capable of coming, as we said earlier, to experience ourselves as the entire universe, as containing all possible reality, as being absolutely free, as being completely unbound by time and space, as already being everything that can exist. That is a possibility of our nature based on the fact that we are conscious beings. Okay, we don't create that end. That's implicit in our nature. That defines all of the possibilities and hence moral choices for us. What makes us a little particular too is that like a dog doesn't choose its end. It's just, it knows it's got to go eat and have sex and all that. And that's true for us too. We have to do those things too. And those are goods that they need to be pursued. But what happens is that because of this transcendent infinite dimension of our nature, we have an intrinsic thirst for freedom, infinity, to encompass everything, but we get really confused. We have to choose immediate goals to get to that fundamental experience of freedom. And we think, since we're blinded by the senses and by stuff around us, that, okay, maybe if I just get more land, more riches, another Ferrari, I'll be happier and more powerful and bigger. And that's the great illusion. If we don't have a deep understanding of what we are as human beings and how this transcendent dimension works in us, then we will mistake these finite sensory routes as some sort of path towards experiencing infinity and power. And you get all of the disruptions and tragedies of our time. You get nations invading nations, you get people raping, pillaging, stealing, accumulating all the world's wealth, starving everybody else, destroying the planet. It's all part of this. It's all driven by our fundamental thirst for infinity and our complete lack of awareness of how we actually experience that infinity. The path is actually the opposite. It's to surrender our obsessive identification with stuff so that we can experience the ground of all that stuff, which encompasses everything, which is why Dante puts this great emphasis on a kind of renunciation. Detachment is kind of key. And the illusion that we can experience infinity by devouring space and time is cupidigia, greed, unbridled greed, and that's what destroys the world. So that's the fundamental picture. What the purpose of Inferno is to awaken us to how we have lost sight of our true nature, how we sell ourselves short by just pursuing stuff in space and time. Purgatory then is meant to redress, unravel that net that we've woven around ourselves so that we can come back to our freedom. Now, the hierarchy, you can think of it, Dante does it in sort of two ways. In the Purgatorio, he says, well, we get the in our blindness, we pursue finite goods like, but they're natural goods and they are goods like sex, food, stuff, we as if they were ends in themselves. That's an illusion. But in general, that damages us, more than others, although, yeah, it can obviously damage others too. But then there's this also, then what happens is that we can start getting our intellect involved in order to start preying on our neighbors. Now, since our intellect is precisely the divine power of love in us, that is a real misuse. That's much worse. And that tends to do real damage. And it gives rise to these fundamental vices like pride and envy and so forth, where we want to destroy our neighbor so that the little ego can experience itself as all powerful. And that is extremely disruptive. That underlying framework is reflected in the Inferno as you go from sins of incontinence. For Francesca, she's hanging out with Paolo. He's really cute. A girl has her needs. She's like not great happy with her husband. And
they're reading I think The Tale of Lancelot.
Yeah, which is meant to warn them against adultery, but she's not reading all that carefully. She's like projecting some of her desires into the text. It's a warning about how to read the comedy, incidentally. But that's fundamentally innocent, in the grand scheme of things. Again, she doesn't understand what love is and what this desire. I often, with students, use an image of ice cubes in water. She imagines she imagines that she sticks to Paolo, she's going to experience somehow, union. But union, the experience of union comes deeper. I often use this analogy of ice cubes. You have an ice cube, 2 ice cubes in a glass of water, right? The ice cube thinks, oh man, he says to the water, look at me, I'm excited, I'm shiny, I'm crystalline, you're nothing, I'm like really cool. And the water says, well, actually, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't exist. You're nothing really in a deep sense, but me, given a kind of finite form.
Right.
And that's the relation more of God and creator and creature. And then think of 2 ice cubes that are next to each other and they fall in love. Oh my God, you are 6-sided. You are so cool. You're shiny. Let's cling together. Let's I don't know what we're doing.
Right.
How do they experience their unity? They both have to awaken to the fact that they're both water. They're already one. This is the fruition of human love, right? We act it out, but the deep thing is that we realize in real love that we are already one. And then physical union becomes a sacramental image of that fundamental reality. But you see what I'm getting at. So that's where Francesca falls short. But then when you get farther down into the Malebolge, there's this kind of dividing line where all of a sudden the intellect gets involved, and it's in order to prey on other people. The intellect that is supposed to be the ground of our recognizing our identity in union with other people instead is used to prey on them as if they were irrevocable others. That is the fundamental perversion. So that's much worse. And it goes all the way down to Satan, who's very uninteresting in himself, because again, it's all based on illusion. That's the other thing. It's an illusory picture of reality that creates evil. And so evil too, it has no real existence. It's all a mirage that we've created. But boy, the suffering from it is real.
Right. And that's one of the interesting things about Dante's version of Satan, is that he's not a particularly interesting figure, and he's kind of just a pathetic mess, stuck in hell, frozen in ice. He's like beating his wings pathetically while munching on sinners. And it's not at all like Milton, where he's like this anti-hero that you're secretly rooting for or whatever. It's none of that. He's just a pathetic mess stuck in a tomb, basically, a tomb of his own design.
All he is he's the image of self-alienation, our alienation from our true self. That's all he is. That's not interesting, right? And in fact, in Dante's idea is that he's flapping his wings. That's what's freezing the ice and keeping him stuck. So it's the image of complete, pointless, empty, sort of rebellion against reality, against our true nature. But it's also a picture, Dennis Turner, to bring him up again, he has a very beautiful way of saying that what hell is simply to trap ourselves, to insist on telling our own stories about ourselves, and trying to constantly define what we are in our own little ways, instead of opening up ourselves to infinite possibilities and freedom. We want to create a little narrative, and boy, we're going to stick to it. And that's what each of those sinners does. They tell you their little narrative, and it's this tiny, miserable thing. The great poet Robert Pinsky said, he said, if hell were about sin and sinners, it would be laughable, Dante's hell. He said, it's about how we sell ourselves short. That's why it's interesting. And
right.
And the dramatic power of it is that we need to have a shock value, if we're really reading it, about realizing that, hey, Francesca's understanding of human love is actually deeper and more refined than mine, and she's in hell. So we got a problem here.
Right.
Ulysses, he's out there seeking, in the last few days of his senses, understanding and knowledge, exploring the world.
Right.
We all do that. That's the definition of modern science. Right? At least not in the greatest physicists, but we all do this stuff. What's wrong with that picture? Why is that not good enough? Well, it's because you're not going to figure out the ultimate mysteries of reality by doing a little more exploring in the last few days of your, that you have to live. That's not the tact. There's nothing wrong with exploring in itself. Just don't think you're going to find the ultimate secret by doing that, because the ultimate secret, as we said a number of times, is not a set of ideas. It's not more information. As Wittgenstein said, more facts just help to set the problem. They do not contribute to its solution, to the mystery of the world in space and time. Wittgenstein said that very clearly in the Tractatus.
If I can then ask, how does Dante, if he ever considers the question, how does Dante understand the relationship between faith and reason throughout his works? I ask this question because there seems to be a few times where reason rather explicitly, or what's sort of personified as reason, has to give way to faith in the Commedia. And I think of two particular instances. One is where Virgil and Dante are trying to enter the city of Dis, like the lower rings of hell, and they can't make it. Nothing that they do is able to break down the gate. And for a while, they're like harassed by Furies and Medusa and etc. And an angel actually has to show up and like break down the doors and chastise the demons, saying, "Hey, these people are on a mission from God, so to speak." And there's another example where Beatrice takes over guiding Dante in the paradise and leaves Virgil behind, because Virgil's, he's not one of the redeemed. He's one of the virtuous pagans stuck in limbo, but he's done all he can to sort of guide Dante through his journey, and now Beatrice sort of has to take over, as it were.
The main issue here is that, remember that, again, revelation, salvation, understanding, it's not a set of ideas. It's not, it's a fundamentally changed experience of self. One could say that what one is after in spiritual life is to come to the I am, which is how, in fact, when Moses asked, well, who should I say sent me? Tell them the I am sent me to you, right? Well, I am is that experience of self as all, as one with God. That's the I am, not I am this or that. You're also I am this or that, but that cannot eclipse, obscure that fundamental grounding and absolute being that is self-awareness, consciousness itself. So no set of ideas is going to save you. It's not a set of ideas that does it. The whole question, what does it mean to believe in God or believe in Christ? And so Dante raises this explicitly. A lot of people say that, but what does it mean? First of all, to believe in Christ, ultimately you have to know Christ. Well, how do you know Christ? Let's think about it. Instead of knowing about Christ, Well, your I ultimately has to denote the same reality as his. That is to know Christ. That's when you know Christ. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Yes, because your I has to be assimilated to his. How does that happen? Through a complete surrender and self-sacrifice of everything you think you are, so that you can awaken to the infinite dimension of your being and live both within and beyond space-time like Christ. So this is, now, how does faith enter into this? Faith fundamentally is the willingness to act on, let's say, a picture of reality that seems contrary to fact, okay? Because our senses tell us, well, all this stuff here is real. God is kind of an abstraction that I've invented with my mind, my own consciousness. Well, that must somehow depend on some chemicals and atoms and stuff, you know, and that's the standard picture. In fact, it's sort of the dominant picture now, too. But I think it really always is, because it's our experience, right? Well, faith is to act as if it were the opposite. It's act as if, well, actually, it looks like that, but you know, the fact is that consciousness, intellect, this dimension of your being is actually primary. And you can come to know yourself as encompassing all space and time. That is a possibility of your nature. Until you know that from direct experience, that to act on that postulate is faith, right? So it's extremely important, you know, to have this dimension, this possibility open. Again, and that's the function of a creed, is to keep saying, well, I am going to act as if this is true, even though I haven't directly experienced it yet, or I've only had glimmers of it. Now, it gets deeper than that, because what are the ultimate grounds of reason and faith? And Dante has this radical move in the Paradiso where he basically says, well, they're the same, which is ultimately the inability of the mind to withhold its assent. And Dante says, when I read, as it's a quoting Augustine, basically, when I read the miracles of Scripture where it seems as if Christ has power over matter, something in me tells me this is true. Well, what is that? That is your own awareness, aware implicitly that it is primary and free and in control of all finite reality. And reason has the same ground. What tells me that 1 + 1 = 2? It's self-evident. I can't contradict it. In the same way, Dante says, faith and reason have the same ground. There's something deep in us that recognizes itself and its freedom.
I think that covers pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about today. Again, though, this is introductory. I mean, we didn't even get to Dante's political theories or political treatises. Again, that's a whole nother topic. But would you have any concluding thoughts for our discussion today? Do you have any book recommendations? I mean, obviously there's the Commedia, but anything that comes to mind?
Yes, Dante is worth reading. The great Dantist theologian Peter Hawkins, he has a wonderful little book. I think it's called Dante Brief History. It's his introductory book to Dante, and he has some quotes in there. And one is great. He says, well, you really have nothing to lose in coming to Dante, except perhaps life as you've known it so far.
Right.
Because it can, if you are really engaging with it deeply, it can really sort of change things. Now, I'm embarrassed to say, we just had this huge centenary of Dante, and they published 1,000 books, and I just retired a couple of years ago, and I'm dealing with all kinds of personal and estate issues. My mother died recently, so I'm totally out of it. But I know some of those are actually very good. I know Zig Baranski's been involved with some of them. There's a companion to Dante, from Cambridge. There's a companion to Dante's comedy, which is also very good. There's a wonderful set of volumes on reviewing Dante's theology that's out from, I forget who published it, but Vittorio Montemaggi's been involved with some of those things, and Simon Gilson and others in England. So there's a lot out there that's come out recently. I'm trying to think if there's one in particular. There's a nice book. My book deals with all the sort of philosophical, metaphysical issues involved and lays out this kind of deep context for understanding all this. And out of that have come some really wonderful things theologically by real theologians. I'm obviously not, but I've learned a lot from my theological friends. And Vittorio Montemaggi has written a wonderful book on the Dante's Divine Comedy as theology, doing theology. It's called Divinity Realized Through Human Encounter, and it's out from Oxford. That's a very nice book, and it's kind of a companion to mine from the theological side. Again, his point is, how do we grow in love? As St. Francis has said, by practicing. and what is the comedy? It's a journey of human encounters. It's entirely made of human encounters from beginning to end, which is, again, an exercise in a growth in love. And what does that do? It unveils divinity gradually. It's a beautiful thing. And there's actually a lot going on, more than just that profound insight. But that's what reading Dante is a journey in self-knowledge. That's what it really is meant to be, self-discovery.
Gotcha. Well, Dr. Moevs, thank you so much for joining with us today.
You're most welcome. It's been fun. I see. I remember a few things about Dante. I thought I forgot everything.
Nice.